Northwest Public Radio, KRFA 91.7.
Good evening, and welcome to the Wednesday, June 10, 2015 meeting of the Moscow Planning and Zoning Commission. The first item on the agenda is approval of the minutes from May 13.
I move to approve.
Thank you, Wendy.
I'll second.
Thank you. Rob? Any comments, corrections, observations? It's just one sheet.
Yeah.
I didn't see anything to note. All right, with that, all in favor of approving the minutes of May 13, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed and abstentions.
One abstention.
Two.
Joel and Deborah abstain. Okay, thank you. Next up, correspondence. Anything from staff?
None from staff this evening.
Okay. Anything from commissioners? All right. Moving along. Joel, Transportation Commission meeting report.
That will be short. During the last meeting, which was probably May 15th, was when I was in Athens, Greece, and I did not attend.
Okay.
And the next meeting was originally scheduled for tomorrow, and that has been canceled.
Okay.
Meaning that the first meeting that's on the agenda will be the second Tuesday in July, if we can scare up a quorum.
About the 9th or something.
I think that's correct.
Okay.
Do you have
All right.
anything wonderful to say about transportation in Athens?
Well, they make very efficient use of sidewalks for parking. It really would be a very difficult city to get around if one had any mobility problems. Too many stairs, too many sidewalks without proper provision, and so on.
Just say nothing of cars in the middle of them.
It's a walking city, and much of the walking occurs in the middle of the street.
All right. Open microphone. This is a point in our agenda where we invite members of the public to come speak to the Commission on matters that are not on our agenda tonight or currently pending before Planning and Zoning Commission. And it's your invitation for folks at home to come on down. All right, next, Mike, review City of Moscow draft floodplain ordinance amendment.
Okay. Well, this was an item that we had introduced, I think, last commission meeting, and it was a requirement of FEMA that we update our ordinance. And so we had gone through last time and looked at the two regulatory floodplains within the city of Moscow. We have Paradise Creek to the north, and we have the South Fork of the Palouse River. The majority of that is in the county. The city-county boundary there is represented in orange. But we talked a little bit about kind of this large area here, Joseph Street ball field somewhere in the middle there. I have a transparent map so Nels would be able to see where that is since he requested that last time. But I also talked about the daylighting project which happened with Paradise Creek over there by the rec center on the university. You see this is mainly represented by just the stream channel itself. That's why it's so narrow there. This is the transparent image so we can see areas over here. Joseph Street ball fields takes up a large portion of that. You have a portion of Heron's Hideout down here, as well as the fairgrounds there that are preserved.
Which year floodplain is this? This is
100 year. Yeah.
Okay.
So it's every year we have 1% chance of hitting this mark.
Do you know the last year we hit?
I think we hit the 100 year in the 96, 97 flood when we had that.
Because it's those folks right there in that pond that have the biggest problem.
Right.
the Meadow
Yeah.
Street people were really flooded quite
Well,
a
and
bit.
also campus was an island.
Yeah.
And then we had, down here, Chinese Village. You see the elevation change where between Palouse River Drive and the highway there when you drop down quite a bit. And so that's all heavily within the floodplain there. This was, just for interest, this is the area that was formerly within the 100-year floodplain. You see the change there between all the area and downtown. So all Almond, Asbury, this portion here, as well as the area down here, that was all consolidated within the channel itself. And so we'd removed quite a few properties within that area, and even properties on the west side of Main Street there. We had Paradise Creek Bicycles, Weedberry's building, One World Cafe. Some of those properties were formerly within the floodplain.
And so, help me understand how that change really took place. What did we do to make that, to confine it into the banks?
Well, it was part of the daylighting project at Paradise Creek, and so it used to just run culverted right along the street here, and then ended up going back into the open channel there. What they had done was part of the rec center project. They had submitted a conditional letter of map amendment, and that gave them essentially a period of time to get the letter of map amendment done. I think it was maybe a 5 to 10 year period where they ended up getting the last LOMA issued, but it was conditional in the beginning, so it gave them that period of time with the understanding that they were going to complete that project and then they were going to do some other projects down here with the channel. They basically excavated some of the channel in those areas. They had hired a consultant that had done all that work to design it, and then created a new stream channel here. But there's still existing channel here within the culvert. So it has two areas. I believe that it reaches a certain level and then it spills over into the culvert and back in. But they had designed, if you notice, by the parking area there on Line Street, if you notice the creek through that area, a substantial amount of work's been done. And they've designed new kind of floodgates and things like that in that area. But it's mainly just the depth of the stream channel itself, where they excavated and dredged that out to create more capacity, as well as just doubling the capacity by creating a new channel. And so what had happened was, originally the consultant and the university were just going to come, I think, to the area that was adjacent to the rec center. The city ended up contacting and working with the university and giving the consultant, I believe, another $7,000 to $10,000 in order to map the whole area all the way down here to the South Couplet, because just the work that was done, in this area in the university and down by Legacy Crossing there, removed all those properties, and so they included that within their remapping, and all those properties were able to be removed from the map.
It reminds me of in '79 when I was hired to be campus planner and architect. The planner, who had worked for Dr. Hartung before, had a couple of ponds planned for the university. Someplace where the rec center is and what have you would have been, he had shown, and apparently people in town had made a lot of fun of him. And so when I came to town in '79, there was an editorial that said, "Oh, we hope this new planner isn't a big late builder type dude," And so looking at all this, it just reminds me of how what possibilities there actually are. We really made I think a serious impact by allowing us to take some of that city land and not have it in that 100-year plain is really a valuable move to development.
And Legacy Crossing, too. I mean, half
Yeah.
of Legacy Crossing was in the 100-year floodplain. That's why University Point building had to be elevated
Exactly.
away from the
Right.
street level there. And I believe they received a variance, so instead of the 2 feet that we require above the base flood elevation, they got a variance for, I think, 1 foot. So it's 1 foot above, and they would have had to go higher if they didn't get that variance. So, yeah, it's a big deal for that area downtown. So, brings us to Chapter 5, which is our flood hazard area chapter. It basically provides the regulations for all development within the special flood hazard area, which is what the technical term for the 100-year floodplain is. We have a zone which is AE, which is our only mapped zone within the city of Moscow. And it goes through methods for reducing flood loss, also provides duties and responsibilities for the floodplain administrator, which is in this case the zoning administrator, the same as the zoning code. Provides for a process for appeals and variances within the chapter. And it also has standards for new construction or substantial improvement, which is typically defined as 50% of the market value of the structure prior to the improvement happening. So, when initiated this whole process was earlier this year. We were contacted by Idaho Department of Water Resources, and they were conducting a floodplain ordinance review. And they usually do this for the National Flood Insurance Program, and that's every 10 years is when they go around conducting these reviews just to ensure compliance with the minimum standards of the program. The last time we had a review was in 2004. They had sent us a follow-up letter a couple months ago telling us that we had some standards that either needed to be added to our current ordinance or some language that needed to be revised with our current ordinance. Most of the things were definitions. We had some state code references that were incorrect, map numbers, variance and appeal procedures that we currently didn't have within our ordinance. Some manufactured home language, and as well as lowest floor elevation requirements. Just to give a background about why Idaho Department of Water Resources is contacting us, they're really the body that implements the floodplain regulations through the state. The state floodplain coordinator is an employee of the state Department of Idaho Department of Water Resources, and she works through, or FEMA works through her. And they're currently reviewing 50 ordinances across the state, and so that's probably all the jurisdictions which have regulatory floodplains within their corporate boundaries. The state works with the communities to meet these requirements, and they're not regulatory, so they only make recommendations. FEMA is really the body that has the authority, and that's through the National Flood Insurance Program, which is issued throughout the city. The National Flood Insurance Program allows federally backed flood insurance for all structures within the city. And so since we participate in this program, even if you're not in the 100-year floodplain and you want to obtain flood insurance, you still can, and you're eligible for a 15% citywide reduction in rates, and that's because we do certain things above what's required as the baseline of the flood insurance program. And so any property owner that wants to carry flood insurance on their property, they're eligible for that 15% reduction of what they normally pay because of things that are in our floodplain ordinance, and then other stream maintenance things we do, property owner notification, and education for stream channel clearance, and our Parks and Streets Department always, whenever there's some type of flood event that may occur, watches those constrained points like Bridge Street to make sure there's no debris that can clog the channel in certain areas, and so that all that work gains us the 15% reduction. And the target date that they had initially given us was, I believe, the middle of July, and they said that was just the typical 3-month window that they work under, and that as long as we're making progress towards adoption of an ordinance, then they're really flexible about when we get the process done. But it's expedient to start as soon as possible. And so just going through the draft ordinance, it looks like a lot of changes, but there aren't that many substantive changes. There's a lot of just updating the language to, it's been over 10 years since this was last updated, and so it's just bringing the language into current technical definitions, and there's a little bit of restructuring that's occurring within the ordinance, and I think that makes it a little bit more user-friendly in going through and having to work through this. And so we begin with kind of the statutory authority within the Idaho state statutes where we are required to have a floodplain ordinance. And it was formerly in Local Land Use Planning Act. And over the years, it's been removed from Local Land Use Planning Act, and now it's in Title 46, which is Militia and Military Affairs. And that's probably why we didn't find it before, is because we weren't looking at militia and military affairs very often. But underneath that title is Chapter 10, State Disaster Preparedness Act. That makes a little bit more sense, but that's where you find it now. So updating that language to correct the reference in there to Idaho Code 46-120 and 46-1024 instead of the Local Land Use Planning Act. Yeah.
So, is there any place where you could refer? I mean, you'd think it would be in that 67, the Planning Act. You'd think it'd be there, be more likely. So is there a way for a reference there that lets you know, hey, and if you're thinking about flood control, please look in the military section?
Keep in mind that the Corps of Engineers, the Department of Defense is regulates these kinds of things.
See the relationship, I get it, but you'd think it would be helpful.
Yeah, and I've noticed the statutes do cross-reference a lot, but I don't believe there is any type of cross-reference in the Local Land Use Planning Act to that chapter. Then we go into findings of fact. This is really the first portion of the ordinance. Talks about losses caused by inadequate structures, structures that are primarily located within the flood hazard area, and the responsibility of the local government to regulate those areas to prevent flood loss. We also have a statement of purpose. It usually ties back to public health, safety, and welfare, as do a lot of land use regulations within the city. And I'm just going to go through this pretty quickly. There's a lot of information, so just stop me if you have any questions as you're reading through the draft ordinance. We go through the objectives and methods of reducing flood loss, and it just provides many examples for doing that, restricting some uses or prohibiting some. Maybe there's outdoor uses which during the flood event may have materials, building supplies, which may be carried down the flood plain within the channel itself and cause some restriction. There may be some walls that are constructed that may cause an adverse impact downstream from the property. Wanted to protect against flood damage for new structures, so they want to make sure that there's adequate elevation and adequate openings for flood waters to go through crawl spaces, things of that nature. Preserve channels within the city. Control actions which may increase flood damage. We usually regulate that through a development permit, so we can review those types of things. Prevent unauthorized construction of flood barriers.
So, Mike, I'm looking at that, the controlling of filling, grading, dredging, which may increase flood damage. So, we have sites that are currently identified on those maps, some of which are undeveloped. Mm-hmm. A particular one would be near the Troy Highway and 95. There's a parcel in there. In fact, there's stuff on both sides of the creek along there. Mm-hmm. Would it not be possible, or what's the mechanism if a developer wanted to? Can they raise the structure? Can they raise the land? I mean, because it changes the dynamics of the channel. It may push the water from their property to their neighbor's property. How does that regulation process work?
Well, within the 100-year flood, they're more concerned with the floodway itself.
Oh, okay.
And so and that's really the actual channel,
Down in
and
the
sometimes
channel.
it goes away from the channel to the actual, to on either side of the channel. But it's really the floodway that you're not allowed to do a whole lot in.
So
I mean,
bridges,
there's
culverts, those issues would be really the ones that are in the...
Yeah, and then if you do those things, you usually have to have a hydraulic engineer issue a no-rise certificate to say that they've analyzed what you're proposing to do, and it's not going to cause an adverse impact for properties downstream. Essentially, there's no rise to the waters in areas downstream
Okay.
of what you're doing.
Okay, thank you.
Then there's a lot of definitions that we have that either need to be added. Sometimes we use the term within the ordinance itself, and it's not defined, and they don't like that, even though there are a lot of words that are used that aren't defined. They've picked some of them that we need to add, and appeal's one of them. And it's just your typical appeal of a zoning administrator's determination is really what that says. Base flood elevation. We have base flood, I think is what we've typically used as that terminology. They want the correct terminology, which is the base flood elevation. And so that's really just the 100-year floodplain. So that's the area that every year you have 1% chance of the water rising to reach that elevation.
I do have a question about, as we appear to be getting less snow, thinking about, I just was up in the primitive area the last few days checking out the Magruder corridor as we're getting ready to do that, and we ran into snow at that level, but everybody says it used to be, at this time of year, it'd be up to your waist or shoulder high, and it's hardly any snow at all. We could have made it through with the four-wheel drive, but I just am wondering, at what point do we start to rethink where the floodplain is? In other words, how many years do we go with less snow?
You're thinking about our typical flood, which is cold plus heavy snow plus Chinook.
Exactly.
And that mechanism might not run so much in the future.
I just know that in my own lifetime as a kid here at the University of Idaho, we had a lot more snow than we have now. And driving back and forth to Boise in the wintertime was a whole different world than it is today. And I'm just wondering, did any of your FEMA people talk about when that time is going to come when you reevaluate what a 100-year flood is? I just was curious if that even is being discussed, because you see it on the news tonight at in Florida. We're losing the swamps are going away. I mean, apparently we've had an 8-inch rise in seawater, and all of a sudden those freshwater swamps in southern Florida are now seawater. And if that's changing, I was just trying to ask myself, when do we get a signal that this floodplain map might be changed a little bit?
Well, I'm sure it could change. It just takes a flood insurance study. So the last one we had was 2002. I think we had done a lot of work up on North Mountain View area, Paradise Creek. We have a lot of work that's been done that is after 2002, like when they put the new culvert in at Joseph Street. That was about 2007, 2008 when they had done that. They had put the large channel in on the east side of Mountain View, right by the Joseph Street ball fields. That's all overflow channel for Paradise Creek.
All right.
But there was never a flood insurance study done after that point. So I would imagine that you see that large balloon shape within the Joseph Street ball fields area, that's probably a retracted sump. You probably don't see that much water. You know, if you were to have a 100-year event, it probably wouldn't reach the boundaries that it's shown on that map. But it just takes a brand new flood insurance study for the whole city, which costs, you know,
It
thousands
does
of
seem like
dollars.
there have been some nice changes in the city, but as the city grows and we get out into that Palouse area where there's more of flood-looking stuff, I mean, that's an issue for developers. If you think you're in the floodplain, it costs you some money to raise a building or do whatever, and so I've just...
Joel, you had a
Well, much of what I've seen in reading some of the climate scientists' work and as applied to this area would tend to indicate that some of the rain on snow on frozen ground events, which we eventually have, might actually be more frequent.
Even more, huh?
So I would be betting on an increase in the size of the 100-year boundary rather than the decrease.
I think warmer and wetter, I think, is what...
Warmer, but a chance that the snowstorm could terminates in warm weather in a Chinook.
Well, I think that's what happened with the 96, 97 flood,
Yeah.
was that it snowed and then immediately turned warm and rained, and that's when...
It had been cold, so the ground was frozen underneath it.
I've got kind of a related question, but it has to do with in the definition of base flood. Is the 1% terminology dictated by FEMA or by Department of Water Resources, or is that something that we're sort of assuming based on 1 year out of 100? And the reason I raise it is that I think it is kind of a misconception that you only have a 100-year flood every 100 years. You might have one every 2 or 3 years or 5 years or whatever, and I'm wondering if that kind of misrepresents what a 100-year flood really is.
It's, the definition comes from FEMA.
It does, okay.
Yeah, it comes from FEMA.
Well, they of course know everything about it. So.
It only happens once every 100 years, but it happens 3 years in a row.
And then whenever they do flood insurance studies, which, you said 2002 was our last one, the whole the floodplain boundary you see up there, that's really the base flood elevation boundary. So that's the 100-year boundary.
Okay.
While we're there, Mike, it's number 7 was G, basement.
Yeah, I see
That
that.
definition looks like it had a problem.
Yeah, I have. I think I copied the same definition as base flood elevation. So that's why I provided the real definition here, which is any area of the building having its floor subgrade below ground level on all sides. Just a slight amendment to development. Really just... I think it's pretty similar to what we had before, but it goes into what development is not. So it goes through, it's not the operation, cleaning, maintenance, or repair of any ditch, canal, lateral drain. So we get a lot of questions where, can I go out there and, the channel runs up against my backyard, or my backyard goes across the channel. The city sends me a letter every year that says I need to maintain that channel, but is that some type of development that's occurring if I'm taking out trees and things like that? And I think this, when they maybe not really need to say it, but I think it's good in order to have them state exactly what the term development is and what it is not. I think it helps with clarity and understanding with the public. FEMA, they just want us to, I think everybody knows what FEMA is, but they wanted us to include that within the definition just so we can all be sure. Flood insurance study. This one we just had some minor changes within this definition, as well as flood proofing. I think we had flood proof before and they didn't like that, and so instead of flood proof we have to add the ing at the end and change the definition a little bit. Flood protection elevation. I think this is one of the larger items that it has changed within the ordinance, and it's always been there, but they've never really defined it. And so the flood protection elevation, we've all known that it's base flood elevation plus 2 feet of freeboard, and so that's that 2 feet you have to go above the base flood elevation, and that's just been narratively described in a lot of the regulations within our ordinance. Now they have a term for it, and it's the flood protection elevation. So I think it's a little bit more user-friendly because you can define that in the beginning and then use it throughout the document, and you can understand it a little bit better, and you don't have to search for things. And so I think that's one of the improvements of the definitions here. And so we're not required to define what freeboard is. Floodway, they just want the correct terminology, which is regulatory floodway, but they want you to point from floodway to regulatory floodplain, so that's why we've done it that way. Freeboard, it's not really a common term. It's more of a FEMA term, and people don't really understand that a whole lot. So we thought we'd add that definition to the list, and that's really the 2 feet above the base flood elevation. And it's a factor of safety expressed in feet above the base flood. It compensates for wave action, obstructed bridge openings, debris, ice jams, and the hydrologic effects of urbanization in a watershed. So that's kind of the things you were talking about, Nils. Maybe the things that we can't control. Somebody places a little bit of fill on property within the 100-year floodplain. All those have some type of effect. They're hard to quantify, but that's why we have the 2 feet of freeboard in order to account for those, maybe rises in certain areas. Yeah, rises in certain areas of town. And highest adjacent grade, it really only comes into play every time you have a new structure built or a substantial improvement to a new structure. An engineer is required to fill out an elevation certificate, and so they can actually show the spot elevations of the lowest floor joists in your house. Maybe it's the basement. Maybe it'll be the lowest floor of that. Oftentimes, in order to make sure that somebody's not going to run into an issue with maybe the foundation is below grade on all sides. There's really an insurance issue with that because you have a 100-year event and water gets into your crawl space or your basement, and there's really no way for it to get out. And so oftentimes we use the highest adjacent grade or the lowest adjacent grade, which we've also defined, in order to determine whether or not there's actually maybe one corner or 2 corners where it's actually even with the bottom of the crawl and it can drain out. If we use that a lot to be able to just let people know, inform people that they may have an issue, because we can legally permit that, basement or crawl space if it meets our requirements, but sometimes they may have an issue with their insurance and it's twice as much as it should be because they had done that. That's pretty common for us to work with people and make sure they're going to meet that regulation.
Well, in the case of small buildings or houses, can it be mitigated by pumping? Is that anything?
Well, it can, but FEMA doesn't give you credit for it. You still have to design the structure with the crawl at a certain elevation, the adjacent grade at a certain elevation, and the big one's the lowest floor. So it's your floor joists. That has to be the lowest floor has to be 2 feet above the base flood elevation. And then so if you have a crawl space under that, sure, you can get a sump pump or something to pump the water out, but you're still probably going to have standing water, and then at the rate of all the water coming in, you're probably not going to get rid of it fast enough for it to make a difference.
Right.
So
It might dry out next week, but
Well, all I'm saying is cities like Boston and New York and Chicago are built underwater. Half of the
New Orleans.
buildings are and they pump all the time. I mean, pumping is just part of life. So I was just trying to, those of us who live in sort of deserty area, well, my gosh, a little water scares us to death, but Chicago's just sitting on a lake, so I don't know. I was trying to get a sense of that difference. You'd think.
Be nice if it drained passively, which is, I think, what the ordinance is trying for.
Yeah, it is, and there are some exemptions to. We'll go into historic structures. There are some exemptions in building codes to historic structures. This is another area where if you have a historic structure, then you get some advantage because you don't have to do certain things if you have that designation. So wanted to define what a historic structure is because we use that in the substantial improvement language. And then we already talked about the lowest adjacent grade being added. Lowest floor is what we had talked about. Usually it's the bottom of your floor joist. In the case, some instances, it usually exempts out your crawl space as your lowest floor. But if you have a basement, that's declared your lowest floor. So they just want some slight changes on that. Mean sea levels used in the development permit section. So if we use something, they want it defined. Regulatory floodway. This is what's replaced what had previously been our floodway within the ordinance, and it just has some minor modifications to that. Start of construction. Minor modifications as well.
Do you get the sense that the same FEMA regulations that are applying to our life do they have an entirely different FEMA description of what's going on in, I just go back to Boston. I mean, they filled in the whole back bay, and it's the whole half of the city is under what was once water. Do you have any idea of
Well, they have a number of different.
Guys have to survive.
They have a number of different zones, and there's a number of regulations that are required for each zone. And that's how they break it out. So within the city of Moscow, we're really just zone AE. But you have A130, you have AH, you have all these areas that have maybe levee systems, things like that. They all have different requirements, and so the majority of these are the requirements for zone AE.
What's that?
AE.
What is that? Is that
I don't know what it stands for. It's just
artificial engineering?
Almost.
Agricultural or something?
I think that another improvement is the start of construction. It provides a lot more detail about when that happens. And so, for instance, if you're excavating for a basement, for your footings, piers, or foundations, that does not constitute the start of construction. It's really just pouring concrete, pouring a slab, footings, installation of those things, and not just the site work that, in the building and planning and zoning industry. Usually the start of construction is getting the site ready. That's typically what occurs first, and I think it's important if that they're not calling that the start of construction, that it be detailed and laid out, which this definition appears to be. So I think that's for clarity and consistency. I think that's a good improvement with that.
And this is all an issue of timing. Permit is issued, you have so much to start construction or not, and da-da-da. And so they wanted a definition of what construction was for their purposes.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then we have to work this one out. I didn't have a definition for structure. They provided an example one, but within the zoning code we have a definition of structure, and so we're working through whether or not I think we can reference that definition within here. It's just a matter of whether or not that definition that they want us to adopt is going to fit within our zoning code definition. And so we'll have to take a look at that after we discuss that with our floodplain administrator or state floodplain coordinator and work through those issues. So that'll be probably on the next iteration. And then this is a new term, substantial damage. It's tied to substantial improvement, but really what it's saying is that within a substantial improvement, a substantial damage is 50% of the market value before the damage occurred to the structure, and it's really tied to the substantial improvement. So if you have substantial damage on a structure, it's automatically a substantial improvement if you're trying to do something to improve it. And that's how, you know, the regulations here have kind of tightened up with the substantial damage. And then that brings us to substantial improvement, which there's quite a few amendments here. I think it's more or less just like a restructuring of the section. A lot of the same things were included before with historic structures, but now it's in a format that reads a little bit better. But like I mentioned before, substantial improvements typically any type of reconstruction, rehabilitation, addition, or other improvement of a structure, the cost of which equals or exceeds 50% of the market value of the structure before the start of construction of the improvement. So they've defined these things and they're using them within other definitions. And so, as far as the language, there's a lot more consistency and clarity in the wording. And then it goes on to include substantial damage, like it mentioned before. And then I think that, one of the better things here is to include what market value is. Previously, it was pretty much just what the local jurisdiction wanted to declare what the market value of a structure was, and so they lay out a couple of things. It could be the appraised value of the structure prior to the start of the initial repair or improvement, or in the case of damage, the value of the structure prior to the damage occurring. And then it goes through some exemptions. If it's a project for the improvement of a structure to correct existing violations of state or local health, sanitary, or safety code violations, that exempts you there. So it wouldn't require you to do everything that's required of a substantial improvement. And then the historic structure language is included as well. They want us to add violation, what definition of what that is, as well as water surface elevation. So those are a couple of items that are included within the ordinance that we don't currently define. Brings us to section 5.3, the general provisions, and the 5.4 administration. There's just a few minor changes within these sections, but really a lot of them are just remaining the same. It talks about just floodplain developments permits that are required. Talks about the zoning administrator being the floodplain administrator for the city, and the requirements of the zoning administrator to make sure you have elevation certificates submitted for each new structure, substantial improvement, reviews all development permits, requires floodplain development permits, maintains inspection reports, databases, provides base flood elevation for citizens through the flood insurance study that's been adopted for the city, things of that nature. So it's really largely staying the same. There is a section on appeals and variances, which is going to be taken out and broken out later on in the ordinance. Section 5-5, which is provisions for a flood hazard reduction. Just a lot of, it looks like there's a lot of changes, but the majority of it's just restructuring and updating a lot of the language that has occurred. Within our subdivision standards, that's one of the things they had dinged us on, was that we didn't have their requirements for new subdivisions. And it usually applies to subdivisions that are 50 lots or greater in size, are required to have all the elevations mapped out. Well, these are already within our subdivision ordinance, and so they didn't find them. They just looked through our floodplain, our flood hazard ordinance, and so I think this is just a matter of where we want it to be located. I think that when we had talked about it, maybe the best thing to do is just have all the floodplain regulations in the floodplain chapter, and then we could just reference it in the subdivision ordinance. So instead of having all the floodplain regulations in the subdivision ordinance, we just vice versa. We just reference that they're in the floodplain ordinance. So, but really, not a whole lot of changes for the subdivision standards from what we already have within our existing ordinance. It wants to eliminate the accessory structure section. There's really no need for this. We have what you call wet flood proofing, which I think has ceased to exist in any type of FEMA regulations for maybe the last 10 years. It's really allowing you to have an accessory structure and to put it at whatever grade your land is, and then just to have flood vents, which would you typically have in a basement that's under your lowest floor elevation of your structure, and that's in order for the flood waters to come into your crawl space and be dispersed and not have the hydrostatic effects on your foundations for all that to be dispersed. What they do, or what our current ordinance does, is allow you to have an accessory structure, put those vents in, and as long as you elevate all your utilities, so say you have all your electrical, heater, HVAC, anything like that, all of those attendant utilities and facilities have to be elevated to the flood protection elevation, so 2 feet above base floodplain. But all your other, it tells you have to keep all utility equipment and things like that elevated to that level, but really after the inspection occurs, you could put all your valuables or anything else in there and they'd still be subject to all the requirements of a 100-year or the 100-year flows of a 100-year floodplain. So they've eliminated that, and so that they don't allow you to do that anymore, but it was still within our crawl space. I think we had permitted a couple of those over the last years, but it wasn't something we had seen a whole lot, but it was always an opportunity, an option for people to be able to do that. But I can see why they eliminated that, because it's just really a liability to be able to permit something like that and then have a flood happen and then all your contents would be destroyed, and it really doesn't protect anything long term. So proposing to eliminate that was the wet flood proofing section. The accessory structures, those are just contained under just all structures, period. And there's two categories: residential and non-residential. And so those are covered. If it's an accessory structure that's non-residential, then it just goes under the regulations for non-residential. If it's residential, it would just go under the residential section. So kind of clarifying that section a little bit and taking out some of the language. And then we have section 5-6, which is variance and appeal procedures. We had reference to this before in the administration chapter, but there's a lot of language being added here. Usually when you go to the Board of Adjustment for a variance, there's a specific process which we already have laid out within our city code. But some things, like I think telecommunication towers, you have relevant criteria and standards which are used, the board uses to approve a conditional use permit or a variance. And so you have to justify each one of those criteria. Telecommunications facilities have their own criteria, and so it's not unheard of to have their own criteria. And that's the way that this is structured, is that there's a criteria for approving variances within the special flood hazard area, and so it gives the Board of Adjustment guidance as to when variances should be approved and when variances should be denied. And so I think this is beneficial, just because how would the Board of Adjustment know the detriment to the floodplain in the area unless they had some type of criteria to go off of and give them guidance. And so I think this is probably, even though it's adding a lot of language to a short section, I think it provides guidance to them and helps them have a consistent and reliable approval or denial each time you have a variance for a flood elevation. And it also adds a section on appeals of zoning administrator interpretations. And then just like the variance section, it goes through the evaluations and relevant factors standards, so the relevant criteria that the Board of Adjustment has to look at when they're looking at an interpretation of a zoning administrator's decision. Things like the danger that materials may be swept onto other lands to injure others. It has to look at all these really technical things in order to prove a variance, and if I think there's any doubt in any one of those, it's probably unlikely that a variance is going to be approved, and that's probably the point, is that they don't want very many variances within those areas because it could cause some negative effects for downstream property owners. And then the last section is penalties for violation. And so this may be removed. It's similar to what we already have with any type of violation of the zoning code. It's a misdemeanor, and I think this is just kind of common language. And so when our city attorney reviews this draft, he'll be able to tell us that, and that may just go away. So the next steps, I'm going to go ahead and send this back to Idaho Department of Water Resources. It'll probably take them a few weeks to review and get back to me as to whether or not we're meeting their requirements. I want the city attorney to take a look at it probably at the same time they're doing that. And then after that, I'll most definitely bring it back to the commission to take a look at any other changes that we've made and any other concerns or questions that you have.
So given what you said, you might not be able to meet the June 24th.
Yeah, I noticed that I had it for the next meeting. I probably won't be able to make that. It'll probably be the meeting after that, if any.
The early July meeting.
Yeah.
When you're working on things with water resources, do you ever see a person, or has this all been done electronically, or how have you communicated?
A lot of it's electronically, just because I believe their office is in Boise, and it's only one lady that's the state floodplain coordinator. So they actually have a consultant out of Boise that they've hired in order to do a lot of this. So when I send an email with questions, I usually send it to the consultant and the state floodplain coordinator. But it's usually the state floodplain coordinator that answers those questions. But I know that, having 50 going on at the same time, it usually takes her a few days to get back to my questions. So I'm just assuming that it's going to take a little while to get back after they've reviewed the draft. So,
okay. But we're making due diligent progress, and we'll just keep chugging
I think
away
the rush is on their end, so I think it's up to them to keep it moving.
Anything else on floodplain? Okay. Mike, moving on. Ground floor residential uses in central business.
Well, we've been talking about ground floor residential a lot lately. But if you recall, we had ordinance 2014-19 at the end of last year that we had discussed and worked on and then talked to, or it was approved by council. And that was to allow residential uses in commercial zones. That was stemmed from kind of our North Main Street corridor discussion, one of the council goals for 2013. And then we had looked at all the rest of the zones and decided that we could add more residential uses within those commercial zones. It was mainly neighborhood business, general business, and motor business where we did the revisions. There was already a lot of the same existing language that allowed residential uses as long as they were behind or above commercial uses, and that was intended to just so long as they didn't interrupt some type of commercial frontage. We added language that stated that on a primary street, except as otherwise authorized herein, and that residential uses may be allowed on the ground floor of secondary street frontages, and this just only applied to corner lots. And so this is just allowed by right within those zones, and so you don't have to go through a conditional use permit, anything like that. You know, you just propose the use, pull a building permit, and through the usual review, and you'd be allowed to do that within those zones. But we also added under the conditional use section residential uses that are located on the ground floor, that are, you know, these are the uses that aren't located behind commercial uses, and so just strictly residential uses from the ground up through a conditional use permit, which requires a public hearing. Industrial, the only thing we did here was just add one dwelling unit per lot or accessory to a permitted principal use. We were running into the fight of the language prior to that said dwelling for a caretaker or watchman on premise, and it was, you know, usually some type of justification of why you needed a caretaker or watchman. So we were tired of having that discussion with people that wanted one. So we just amended that to allow one dwelling unit per lot. Maybe it's a live-work type situation, or maybe it is for a caretaker or watchman on premise. So this happened last year. We recently talked urban mixed commercial about kind of ground floor, maybe the recent market analysis there that indicated that, you know, maybe we might not get retail strictly on the ground floor throughout the whole area. But we were recently approached by Phil Roderick, owner of CJ's, who's located in the Central Business District on North Main Street, and he was interested in converting the entire building to residential. And if you right now it's a nightclub. I think they have some type of ballroom, dancing, like a large ballroom on the second story, and then I believe there's some type of bar on the ground floor. We had started to, talk to him about that, and really looking around the Central Business District, we noticed that there were a lot of residential uses that were located on the edge of the district, not necessarily on the main core, And you have some of these existing buildings which may not work with retail on the ground floor. We're looking at Phil's building, and I have a picture of it coming up, but it's not. There's not a whole lot of windows, even though there are openings, and you'd be required, if you were to convert it to residential, to fill all those openings in with windows. But the way it's built, you have almost daylight windows on the very bottom, and then you have windows or window openings that are probably 10 feet, 12 feet off the ground, which isn't that typical commercial frontage that you generally see with a central business zone. We also had that, like I mentioned before, the recent discussion of the horizontal versus mixed use development, and how, we typically think of everything as vertical with the retail on the ground floor. Maybe it's office on the second story, and then on the third, fourth, fifth floors we have some type of residential, and that there are different ways of horizontal mixed use that accomplish a lot of the same things. Right now, we do allow residential and central business. It's just required that it has to be above or behind commercial uses, like the similar language that we have within those other zones. And the commission may look at ground floor residential as a conditional use permit, like we've done with those other zoning districts, with specific language relating to having to be located at the edge of the district. And so, those were our initial thoughts. I'd gone through and looked at a zoning map, and the properties that are outlined in red right now are properties that are residential. CJ's property is not. I've just highlighted that so you know where it is on the map. But the rest of these properties are. This is where we're at right now. City Hall. The property's right here on 2nd Street. Those are all within the central business. You have a kind of the areas on the edge that could go either way. They could get maybe a professional office or some type of residential on the ground floor. And so I think it's just, maybe providing for those opportunities where it could go either way. But if you look at it, the majority of these are located on the edge of the central business district. This is Phil's building here. You can see it's, you have the entrance, but then you have these really half windows, daylight basement windows here, all along the street frontage. And then these windows here, probably 12 feet, up in the air. So not really conducive to that retail, ground floor space, because it's really a half floor is where those large windows start there.
Yeah, this one, that's what I was, this right
And
here.
that's,
has this just been, that was historically a hotel, Del Norte, and it's been residential forever, but it just ended up being in the CBD, huh?
Yeah, it's in, right across the street from CJ's. That's that property right there.
Right.
So they're still, kind of on that edge, but same thing. It could be converted to some type of commercial use, but it's really the kind of example we were looking at within Legacy Crossing about maybe what the residential may look like in some of those areas. That's a shot
Well,
from
I
the
suppose
corner.
we're talking like we'd like to have the city grow a little bit, but we don't have any very good examples of why it will. Because it jumps out to some place where it's in motor business, and we, because we look at our downtown, that has been basically the same thing for the last 70 years. And we have done precious little. I don't want to speak too loudly about that, but it doesn't seem like we've done much to change the downtown. What's changed is out in the motor world.
So, Mike, that's legal non-conforming right now.
It'd be legal non-conforming, yeah. So you'd have an issue there. All those properties outlined in red would be, they wouldn't be allowed to be rebuilt unless you had some type of commercial in the front. So, it would give them a kind of a relief valve there. I'm sure that if they were going to sell the property, there'd be an issue with mortgage companies lending on the property, because if it burnt down, it wouldn't be allowed to be rebuilt unless there was some type of commercial on the ground floor right up against the street incorporated within the project. And so they'd have an issue there.
Yeah.
And when you showed on the map, and they're that way, I think, the 3 houses that are really just being used as houses.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're lovely houses too.
Oh, yeah.
Really first class.
Right. So again, legal
They look
non-conforming.
wonderful.
And,
Yeah, same
and,
thing.
Again, given the nature of the comments about the growth of our downtown, it'll be a long time before those houses are needed as central business district.
Well, I think the
lots.
market will dictate that, and then when they at the highest and best use, all of a sudden we've grown 30, 40 years, and maybe it does expand that way. Well, they certainly can still do downtown development there. It gives them a little bit of flexibility.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's a terrible term. What we really mean is, does it make more money than something else? It isn't talking about best. We know.
So you're starting to suggest that it would be a CUP as a mechanism.
Yeah, I think that, when we had talked about it, it was maybe definitely a conditional use permit, but some type of language in there like we had inserted with the window opening requirements about primary activity centers. Well, I don't know that we'd want necessarily between 2nd and maybe 7th Street or 6th Street, the prime retail corridor there. I don't know that you'd want residential on the ground floor in those areas. That you want to protect that. I think that's always going to remain retail on the bottom floor, and I think it might hurt that area. But in these areas where it's kind of a transitional area, and it maybe doesn't carry that same building frontage, street wall all the way down, then you have certain buildings that may just not be conducive to some type of retail on the bottom floor. Like, I think CJ's, this building here, just may give some flexibility, and then maybe with within that language, conditional use permit, residential on the ground floor, located, we'd have to come up with something, located on the periphery of the central business district, or not located on the primary corridor on Main Street. We'd certainly come up with something that would give guidance to the board to be able to not allow something right at the heart of Friendship Square, on the ground floor.
It makes you wonder if this building, take the frontage on Main Street, if those units could be turned into some retail activity, would it be more valued? Forget what I just said about highest and best use, and what would it be an advantage to the owner to have resident or to have retail things going on on that first floor? I wonder would it be a sizable increase? These people, a lot of these people, I think, who live in that place have been there for a long time.
Well, it seems like a store. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Is my memory correct? It seems to me that in 1970 or 1971, there was actually a doctor's office on the first floor. Is that possible? Seems to
I'm
me
not that old.
It seems to me that I actually went to a doctor's office there.
Oh, is that right?
I was just going to say, historically, neither of those buildings, they are both historic structures, and neither of them were ever used for retail. They've always been either, I don't know what CJ's was, but this was a hotel. And so maybe there's some way of addressing the historic use of the building, and how it since it's in our historic district, that they weren't ever in retail, and they aren't really appropriate for retail.
Well, and are we saying retail or commercial? Because
I'm saying retail,
you're saying retail, but
storefront normally goes with retail, and you don't usually put storefront in dentist's office or
right.
That it would be, I guess.
It isn't really in our historic district, isn't it?
I guess it's one block out. Yeah,
I think we're on First. I think our line is on First.
Right there, our line is right there. But historically, they were never retail structures, and they are historic.
I just wonder what's under that siding. I've always wanted to, because that was the Hotel Del Norte, early brick building that was, I don't know what changes took place. Joel, help.
I don't clearly remember. But I think the possibility of white brick sticks in my mind.
These are some residential structures here. This is A and Jackson. And you may recall we were discussing I think the rezoning of the other side of the street. So we rezoned it. Central Business used to extend across the street here, and we recently, it was a number of years ago, rezoned that to residential office. And so we had contacted this property owner here and asked whether or not he wanted to be included within the residential office designation, and at the time he said he didn't. He wanted to remain central business and was holding out for maybe some type of commercial use that would go in there and take out maybe all those structures, because I think he owns all 4 of them there. And so that's another example of some residential structures we still have within that central business. But the access here on the state highway, and unless you were to tear them all down and do something, I think you'd have an issue with access there, and I don't know that would go commercial for quite some time.
Just because of the inability to get in and out of the property, you think?
Yeah.
So now they're empty with,
I think one, I think
Maybe
maybe
that one.
these two are occupied. I know this one is occupied. This one, I don't think anybody's there, living
I
in
don't
there.
think so either.
but if they're currently essentially legal non-conforming uses as houses,
Yeah.
we might, through this move, encourage them to get back into
Yeah.
better
exactly.
uses and
Yeah.
on the tax rolls
Yeah.
in a better state than
Because
they currently
that
are.
may be it, that somebody wants to purchase one and they can't get a loan, and then you have somebody with just a cash sale that comes up, or maybe it's a lot lower of a price. There's a lot of factors when you can't be able to rebuild the use in the zone, and so, that may spur more investment in those
Do
properties.
you think they're just sitting there because of the difficult traffic and because it's so hard to see a use? Because you'd think that these two houses look sound enough, they could be moved. Boston Care could move those over to another site and do something else on this, but I'm not sure what else would be easy or wonderful.
We have this property, we're going to give
We're going to give a award to this one right here.
On Tim Gressback's law office on 7th Street, the Ocularium, Plus Ocularium's right here.
Mm-hmm.
Well, this is a property that the central business line runs right along the alley. A number of years back, they had gone to the Board of Adjustment to get a variance for residential on the ground floor, which I think probably constituted a use variance, but it was still approved. And they were able to do that. So you've seen this property kind of go back and forth between a professional office and a residential property a number of times. And it was really that variance that allowed them to be able to do that. But most recently, Tim thought it'd be a good office and did a really major renovation on it. And turned it back into an office.
Of course, the significant difference between this and those other little houses is traffic's not going fast by this. This is a lovely little street to be on, as opposed to having 3 lanes of fast-moving traffic.
Just another shot, the Ocularium here, and Tim's office.
We don't have that many places in Moscow where houses have been turned into commercial. I'm thinking about the 23rd Street area in Portland where they're just house after house after house is turned into something commercial in a rather charming way. But we don't seem to have those in Moscow.
Terragraphics has that there over.
Yeah,
Well, there's a couple
that's a good
going
example.
First Street, is
Yeah.
it First Street or attorneys up, past the Master Gardener Garden, is that First Street? I know maybe. Anyway, there's a few.
There's a
but-
few. But
And then, another advantage for these to be in central business is that there's no parking requirements. And so, in order to convert maybe a residential structure to a professional office, maybe it's, you have 2 parking spaces now. Well, it jumps up to a professional office, you're probably looking at 4 or 5 spaces that are going to be required. So, that facilitates the conversion a lot, easier, just because that's probably one of the greatest hang-ups you run into when kind of converting these is off-street parking.
From a preservation standpoint, I like the flexibility of the houses that are kind of on that margin zone where people don't want to necessarily live, but they work well as an attorney's office or a dentist's office or an accountant's office or something.
It's interesting, the houses they're not in the CBD, but A Street is one of those unusual streets where we in the city seem to think we're going to straighten make that street more wonderful and make it more car. And then people said, no, we want to live here. And in fact, remember, we changed those little houses on the south side of the street to make it possible for them to be residential, even though A Street's quite busy. And they seem to be still used in that way. People are cling to that A Street.
Well, it's close to campus. Close to campus.
And this is just on 6. You can see Washington down here. The All Souls Church, I think it's right here.
Yeah, that
in
is
the alley.
another example, that little one next
Yeah,
door.
I think this is a some type of assessor's office.
No,
It was,
it
and
was-
I don't know if it still is. Appraiser.
Yeah.
Kim
Okay.
Nunn, but I don't know if it's, if he might be retired. I wonder if it still is an appraiser place.
I think it's all just residential.
Okay. Yeah, I know this building was residential. Yeah, I guess residential now, but it used to be the appraiser. And then these are the law offices here on the corner. But once again, it's kind of in this transitional area. The greenhouse, the old parsonage that was over here that was for sale recently, that was one of the inquiries that we got, was maybe converting it into some type of commercial use with residential above, like a juice bar on the bottom floor type of thing. So I think that just another example of one of these, the location of these structures, just to be able to go either way, commercial or residential. So I just wanted to get the commission's direction. Certainly could have staff look at the ground floor residential and central business through a conditional use permit with the language that we talked about of having to be located at the edge of the district.
I certainly support it. You've convinced me.
And that would mean defining what edge means, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we'd have to think about that, and
Yeah.
bring it back next time. And
Or is the primary activity center notion that we've talked about in Legacy?
or we could do that too. Yeah.
In other words, define it the opposite way.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, it does seem that we have examples now that have crossed back and forth, and they're on the side streets that feed into Washington or Jackson, and that's probably a good way to do the transitioning. As the pressure builds, they'll get converted to commercial uses, and as they're inadequate, they'll get replaced by more substantial commercial uses.
Yeah.
And if not, it can retreat the other way, especially if it's like the law office. It gets to a point where the lawyer closes down shop. It's easier just to maybe rent it for some years as a house before selling it or whatever.
Yeah. It gives flexibility.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think I'm hearing a sense of the commission that, yeah, it's worth.
Okay.
And so if the floodplain one gets delayed, might this come back?
Sure.
Soon?
Yeah. Definitely could do that next meeting.
Okay. That brings us up to number 8, our shared readings. And there were 3 that were all around walking. I'll try to summarize them really quickly. Folks who are interested in reading those shared readings can find them linked from the P&Z webpage on the city's website. Down in the lower right is a link to shared readings, and then they're all just in reverse chronological order. One was, I guess I would summarize it as essentially a review of medical research on, the title was The Right Dose of Exercise, and the notion of some amount of exercise in these mega studies was really demonstratively significant in reducing the death rate of middle-aged people who I like to think of myself as. And what struck me was it was 450 minutes a week, essentially an hour a day. And the piece that struck me was that's walking to work and back for a lot of people in this town. You know, half hour into work, half hour home. The second article was more of an economic analysis, walkability, quality of spaces, and it was focused around Golden, Colorado, and things they did to their Main Street. It sounds like their Main Street is catching up with our Main Street in terms of becoming a more pedestrian-friendly space. And what I saw was the vacancy rate downtown went way down, which seemed to be good for tax revenue and those advantages. And I saw, subsequent to this list getting put together, another story on Albert Lee, Minnesota, which was essentially the same thing. They took the next step. They actually actively organized walking clubs and groups of people to get out there, and that once they got that ball rolling, then the ball kept rolling. And downtown revitalized a bunch, and then city put in hardscape to help, but the clubs helped as well. And then the third article was kind of a review of popular literature stuff. It was titled Walking Going Places, and it was integrating that this building magazine has been running articles on walking, and the New York Times and stuff like that. So it's kind of I thought it was an interesting package of pieces, and I'll let you react, and I've got some data to share.
One thing, and I can't remember which article it was, but it talked about a walkable street where you had a buffer of parking. So you had your sidewalk parking that buffered the traffic and tree line, and I thought he just described our Main Street. And I thought, well, gosh, the folks that talked about planting trees 20 or 30 years ago and did that, and then taking the main traffic and pushing it out, made the perfect walking area that was described in that article. Mm-hmm. It really struck me that there's been some pretty forward thinking going on here for these years. I thought it was pretty good.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And getting the trucks out of there
Yeah.
made the rest of that possible.
Yeah.
But trying to walk to the mall is about as unpleasant
Well,
a
for
walk
sure.
as you could ever. My son, who doesn't drive, is about the only person I know who actually does that. And there's no buffer, really, between the sidewalk.
So it
and,
makes it, getting to the mall from the people over more south, for me, now I've learned going to the mall can be rather pleasant because I can take the trail and it winds around,
That's
but it's
true,
a beautiful bike
On a
ride.
biking.
And then you get to the mall, and of course it's crummy at the mall, but I don't have to, the people on the north side of the highway don't have that same opportunity. And I don't know, it took me a while to discover that, but I found going to now that there's always a coffee shop that I can go to, so it's a prize at the end of a bike ride.
Right.
We just don't go there. Our solution.
Yeah. So, Mike, could you get up the couple of PowerPoint slides? I asked Mike to go into the 2014 citizen survey data and pull up our question, which has these various compare-contrast choices. And the left column is more walking-oriented than the right column, I think. You'll see the words longer commute, drive to things, etc. if you read the right column, and you'll see walk to, and more compact kinds of notions if you read the left column. And the one where it flips over is that second green band, which seems to be about attached versus detached. And I don't want common walls piece. Anyway, the next slide. So the Moscow Affordable Housing Trust has been doing some market study and to try to identify affordable, the federal word, affordable, housing demand. And I had my graduate student this is the same data set the 2014 citizen survey, it asks a question about household income, and it asks a question about household size. And so we filtered the citizen survey data by those two criteria to get the 1 and 2 person households who earn in the income bracket that the Moscow Affordable Housing Trust is focused on. And now those same questions, and we also sorted it out by age, because that was another, age bracket was another question in the citizen survey. And I went through and put some underlines under where it was more than 60-40 kind of split. There's some interesting patterns, I think. So in that first band, the kind of blue-gray, mixed housing and commercial, you look out there at the 55 to 64-year-old group, seems to be attracted to that, which would be a walkable neighborhood kind of character compared to the single-family residential, which is described in the previous, in the questions, which we saw in the previous slide as less walkable. A small yard ought to contribute to walkability. So what I'm pointing out to you is, if you look in our data, not in aggregate, but for subpopulations, there seems to be greater proclivity amongst some of them for some of these features that would make it more walkable. So you might have a certain age group that's more interested in, oh yeah, I'll compromise and live here and walk, or have different values. Anyway, so we've been poking around in that data, as well as, we were very fortunate the U of I helped us do a survey of U of I staff with our own instrument, and poking around in that, and I will bring you results of that. They're just about done, maybe a month from now. Mike, if we could look at the next slide. Here was the problem. This is the citizen survey data, and the question was, what is your current housing type? And we organized it by age range, but it's not filtered for income or household size. I put the orange on the fact that in that youngest age group, we have respondents, 8 of them are in single-family detached locations, and only 1 is in a condo and 1 is in a mobile home. What I'm wondering is whether the survey, the methodology was random. It arrived in the hands of an apartment dweller in October who just pitched it. So we didn't get, so I'm almost questioning the previous slide, some of the data there, because I'm saying, oh, look at this. Maybe we didn't get a good sampling of some age groups, because you'd think that in that 25 to 34 bracket, you would see more apartment dwellers than single-family house dwellers. So there's some tendency, I think, in the citizen survey data to say there's a push for walking, and there's reason to critique it here. And then the last slide, Mike, is the Transportation Commission's question. And I asked Mike just to filter it for the things. Transportation had a long laundry list of what do you prioritize. Filter it for the walking, biking items that had fairly strong support, just so that we could see what interest there was in the community for those walking capabilities.
Making sidewalks more accessible for people with disabilities. I've been noticed, Mike Smith, the kid that runs around with his little machine and has a little flag over. I'm noticing that he doesn't use our street much anymore, and I think it's because, I can name them, I won't, but there's like 5 properties on 3rd that have let their sidewalk just go to rack and ruin, and it's almost, it would be rough for Michael to deal with them. They're really, it's really, I noticed it, Joyce and I were riding home on our bikes, and we'd forgot our lights, and so we thought, well, we better stay on the sidewalk because we didn't have a light. And man, the sidewalk was just atrocious. And I thought, that's why Mike isn't using that anymore, because that very thing, in terms of safer or accessible, you don't mind a little bump here and there, but boy, when the sidewalks go to pieces, then it's hard. But of course, we're talking about just a few people that do that. But Mike used to come by our house all the time, and now I don't see him. And maybe he's just got a nuance.
Yeah, there are some sidewalks around town that are pretty tough to actually walk on because they're so fragmented.
Roots that are lifted up a piece.
Lifted up, broken. I walk all over,
and in the daytime, it
one.
isn't so bad. But boy, if you're doing it at night, it can really be an issue. So I'm now beginning to think about a little posturing toward another one of these. Look at the sidewalk. We've done that a couple of times in the last 30
Yeah,
years.
I cracked the rib last year tripping on a sidewalk in broad daylight, walking down Howard Street, I think. Or no, Polk Street. Just off 3rd. Airborne.
So the kind of planning question is, if we wanted to encourage walking for all the reasons that those articles are pointing at, what would be the thing? One of them isn't planning, but it's a maintenance mechanism. What would keep the sidewalks in better shape than these examples? And the other would be, what if a lot more people started walking? What would 6th look like as it approaches campus if you had even more foot traffic?
I don't think 6th would be the artery. Oh, you mean, well, 6th once you get into downtown, but certainly not.
Not up the hill.
Not up the hill.
3rd would become more of the artery. But there might be other planning considerations.
Well, I think one big planning consideration that I'll throw in is that we have basically from D Street all the way over to the Troy Highway, we have the historic grid of the city. It's well connected. It has sidewalks on all those streets. It's basically a series of walkable neighborhoods. And we have the problem of Moscow growing to the east and beyond into Troy over the last 20 years or 25 years with no plan to get that traffic around those walkable neighborhoods. So those walkable neighborhoods are being sacrificed as vehicular conduits for all the people moving from the east to get to campus or to Pullman or to the mall in an efficient way. And I think we need to think about how that happens, because the impact has been episodic. I mean, it's like one development happens, then another, without any kind of big plan of how you move that traffic so it doesn't destroy the historic, already walkable neighborhoods. And so I guess I'll put my 2 cents in there. That's a big planning issue that hasn't been appropriately addressed since I've lived here. I watched the first farm get broken up east of Moscow when I lived east of Moscow out on Wallen Road, and would come into town, and then we've had all this development there, which is fine. It's people want that choice, and I'm not saying that it shouldn't happen, but it all happened without any plan of how to handle all the traffic that wants to jet through the historic grid. So that's my 2 cents.
We noticed that a lot of people use the residential streets in our neighborhood to avoid some of the busier corners when they're coming and going.
Yeah, I mean, they blast down First Street, they blast down B
Ours
Street,
too.
they blast down, I mean, it's like, unless we put stop signs at every intersection, which I think is a good solution, because then
I do
people
too.
would find another way, personally, in that whole grid, or traffic calming or whatever.
Wendy, do you think those little circular things that Portland and Seattle uses, do you think we should try several of those and see how they work?
I was wondering about those, or whether just four-way stops kind of does the
Four-way
same thing.
stops would make a
They,
big
they just
Yeah, I
do
like
it,
the
you know.
little round things.
Because we have
don't
snow
make
and they
you stop.
don't. And you slide into those things.
Yeah, those are, I see a lot of this.
Snow
Yeah.
would be a problem.
Snow,
And
you
there's
know, you
not
slide, you
necessarily
think
enough-
about sliding into them in snow. If we get snow again, if we have a winter with snow.
Well, plowing around them
Yeah,
as well.
right, right.
But-
So,
And I don't know what they do in, I've never had a good answer from any planner in Portland or Seattle about the fire trucks. I presume that you're not allowed to plant a big tree in one of those things. You can have, because I think the fire truck has to just drive over them.
the ones
if
I've
it
seen are more
happens.
like just a
Just
little
a little
landscape,
landscape
like
there.
a little mini traffic
Right.
rotary in a
Tiny
sense,
circle.
yeah.
But
Yeah.
I
Stop
would
signs
just be
make more
curious,
sense.
what if we put in, what if on one of the streets, like let's say B or something, we decided to just put in three of those things and see what it did? It would be interesting to,
If
Test
they're
it
meant to
out.
be planted, who plants them and takes care of them?
Probably the
We have a
streets
history
department
of
or the
not taking
parks
care of
department.
city plantings. That's my observation.
Is this something we'd like Joel to take to transportation? Because I don't know where it fits relative to the multimodal transportation plan. Just Wendy's whole
Yeah.
broad concern about.
Well, we have a distributed grid and a well-connected grid, and it's a walkable grid. But the problem is it's really meant for that grid, and everybody uses it as the conduit to get through it to wherever they want to go, from east to west, when they don't really need to be in that grid other than to get to the point B. And so how does that get addressed, you know? And is it too late? I don't know. But it's going to, if we continue to develop to the east, which seems to have been the pattern in the last 25 years, it's just going to get worse and worse. So I don't know what the solution is, but that's
That issue is one we keep talking about in transportation, but I'm not sure that we've come up
I mean, I know-
with any brilliant solutions.
I know living in the grid,
Yeah.
I go over to D. I go down D because it is pretty much an arterial, and I do everything I can to avoid 3rd Street if I have to go west, and I go around it and around the traffic clogging and everything else. So I'm not sure bringing more traffic into that clog zone is the right approach either. I don't know. It's
well, one of the things that comes up the minute you have this conversation, we know about 6th and we know about 3rd and we know about D, but then the next half mile is rodeo, and it's nobody's even had the courage to even mention it, and so if you look at putting more people out here, more and more houses, then rodeo becomes an important thing, and it could be something that could be on a plan, but I haven't heard it discussed much. But you can see that it'll
At the moment, rodeo, and people come in rodeo, come south on Polk, turn at that awful intersection, skewed intersection onto public, veer onto F to head down to the schools to pick up their kids. That's becoming a major east-west circuit. I keep asking about accident records at that awful intersection, but apparently there haven't been any major ones yet. But
But anyway, the bottom line of what I was trying to say is that walkability and promoting it depends in part on preserving the quality of the neighborhoods that are already walkable as a basic starting point.
Right.
So.
And along that line, I was pleased to see the other day that there are now sharrows painted on. It was.
I saw a couple on.
You saw them on Lynn. I saw them on Harold leading up to Lynn, And
Yeah.
I have ridden that route because it's a fairly nice grade and it keeps you off of Blaine on a bike if you're headed, up across the hill.
So where, it's a,
So it starts from the
north-south?
Armory,
okay,
running both east and west, but the route I would be taking would be west on Harold from the Armory, and then hit Lynn, and then turn north up Lynn, which is at that point a shallow grade.
yeah.
So that's another part of that conversation, is
Right.
to start to really say, making drivers aware that we're encouraging bikes out here.
Have you seen the new bike parking on 3rd? They'd taken up a parallel parking space and put just a big corral type thing, so it's bicycle parking on it.
My husband noticed it because his building is 2 blocks away, or 2 buildings away, and he's wondering what it's going to mean for for parking capacity. But no, I think it's great personally.
Where on Third is it?
Yeah.
It's just right in front of
Yeah.
Cafe Artista
Oh, okay.
on Main.
Okay.
Oh, at 3rd and Main, right.
Yeah.
I haven't
Yeah.
tried
Seen
to
that.
park in it, but I don't know
Oh,
whether
that's-
it's
yes,
Yeah, it's like it
usable or
takes
not.
up. Yeah, it's
a little,
a,
like
did
a
see
little
that.
corral or something.
Yeah,
Yeah.
wrought iron corral.
Yeah.
So that sign
Who put
says
that in?
Bike City.
yeah. I think it's a.
The Transportation Commission has been talking about parking inadequacies for bicycles downtown.
Yeah.
And that experiment is a
Yeah.
sort of an outgrowth of that conversation. And
Has it been used much? Have you noticed?
I saw there was 4 or 5 bikes in it when I
So
drove
we're-
by. Yeah.
We're back at that conversation about more bike parking downtown that we had several years ago, and that we recommended that Central Business District business owners be encouraged or even required. I don't remember the language of it, and the city council
Turned it down.
turned us down.
Yeah.
Seems like the conversation's coming back around again.
Well, wonderful. So part of the reason I was trying to think about what was on the agenda, we've got a public hearing coming next time, correct? On a land use action. Then we might have a public hearing on one of these ordinance revisions, but it probably won't be a very long or contentious sort of thing, the floodplain one, for example. Yeah, this is a call for the next round of readings, basically, and just probably be a month and a half before we would get around to talking about them, but inviting you to think about a topic, and charge me with trying to find some things or some things, whichever you want to do.
Just in case you might have missed it, for those of you who might be interested, on next Wednesday, we're having an open house for
Thank you for remembering.
Fort Russell,
Yeah.
enhancing and enlarging the Fort Russell district. It's going to be in the 1912 great room, and
Next Thursday.
it should be a fun.
Wednesday.
It should be. I'm hoping it'll be reasonably well attended,
Yeah.
because we're really. So it has to do tangentially with all these things of walkability and sidewalk, because it's between D and 3rd, basically, and Hayes and downtown. And we think we've got a good rationale to increase the size of the district.
Yeah, sort of clarifying that, we started out wanting to clarify the boundaries, and then that led to doing a big reconnaissance survey and looking at maybe where the logical boundaries might be, and to clarify them, and also looking at the time frame and extending a little bit, because it only went to 1930 with the 1980 district, which would have been 50 years at the time. And there were a number of people who didn't want to be included at the time because they were afraid it would either raise their taxes or the government would tell them what to do, and none of that is true with the National Register. So part of this is an educational process too, what the being on the National Register really means. And then what else am I missing? Those are the main things. And then also looking individually at properties as contributing properties, and sort of adding more to the list. Yeah.
So that's a week from tonight?
Yes.
Week from tonight, and what time is it, Michael?
5 to 7 at the
Oh,
19.
early,
great-
5 to 7
great room
at the
in
great room.
1912.
Okay, great.
And it's
So
more
please come if
informational.
you're interested in just kind of seeing and listening to people in terms of talking about the Berry area. The Wendy's talking about this walkable good area.
And I think the grid goes past that all the way,
All the way to
personally,
Troy
all the way
Highway.
over to the Troy Highway. It's really that 7th Street, 8th Street, all those streets in there, they're all walkable, they're all runnable. I run them all the time. Anyway, so, yeah.
Thanks for that reminder announcement. Anything else? We'll be adjourned.
Okay. I will not be.